Have you ever been completely alone in your home in the dead of night and heard something that just couldn't be explained? A soft scratching, a distant whisper, a floorboard creak when no one else was there. Tonight, as the moon casts its long, silvery shadows across the land, I want to share with you the unsettling, real experiences from my old house, where the midnight whispers became a part of everyday life, challenging everything I thought I knew about silence and solitude. These weren't the usual creaks and groans of an aging structure, you see, but something far more personal, far more insistent, weaving themselves into the fabric of my nights, and slowly, subtly, changing the way I perceived the very air around me. It all began rather innocently, or so I told myself at first, dismissing the subtle shifts in the atmosphere as mere imagination, the tricks of a tired mind playing games in the quiet hours when the world outside had settled into its deep slumber. My house, a charming but undeniably ancient Victorian, sat perched on a slight hill, overlooking a quiet, tree-lined street. It had always held a certain allure, a sense of history clinging to its ornate trim and fading paint. When I first moved in, the echoes of its past felt comforting, a gentle reminder of lives lived within its walls. I spent my days unpacking boxes, admiring the intricate details of the molding and dreaming of the future. The nights, however, introduced a different kind of companionship. At first, it was just the wind, I was sure of it, whistling through unseen gaps in the old window frames, creating a symphony of subtle moans and sighs that seemed to ebb and flow with the strength of the breeze. But then, as the weeks turned into months, a new layer of sound began to emerge, distinct from the natural cadence of an old house settling. It usually started around midnight, or perhaps a little later, when the last car had passed down the street and the neighborhood dogs had finished their final, weary barks. A profound quiet would descend, a hush so deep it almost felt heavy, as if the air itself was holding its breath. And it was within this profound stillness that the whispers would begin. They were faint at first, so incredibly soft that I often questioned if I had truly heard them at all. A fleeting suggestion of a human voice, just beyond the edge of audibility, a mere ghost of a sound that teased the edges of my perception. I'd lift my head from my book, my eyes darting around the darkened room, straining to pinpoint the source. Nothing, just the oppressive silence. I try to rationalize it, convincing myself it was the hum of the refrigerator, or perhaps the pipes expanding and contracting with the sudden drop in temperature. But deep down, a flicker of unease would ignite, a tiny spark in the vast darkness of my skepticism. One evening I was drifting off to sleep, tucked snugly under my thick duvet when I heard it again. This time it was clearer, a distinct murmur as if someone was speaking just outside my bedroom door, too low for me to make out the words. My heart gave a little jolt, a quick, nervous flutter against my ribs. I sat bolt upright, my senses immediately on high alert. I held my breath, listening intently, the sudden stillness of my body amplifying every tiny sound around me. The house was absolutely silent. Not even the usual creaks were stirring. Then, just as I was about to dismiss it as another trick of the mind, a different sound materialized. A light, rhythmic scratching coming from inside the wall directly beside my bed. It wasn't the frantic scurry of a mouse, nor the gnawing of termites. This was a deliberate, almost methodical scratching, as if tiny, unseen fingers were tracing patterns on the plaster from the other side. My breath hitched in my throat. I reached for my phone, its cool metal a small comfort in the sudden chill that seemed to have permeated the room. I tried to shine the flashlight on the wall, as if a beam of light could somehow dispel the unseen presence. The scratching stopped abruptly. I waited, holding my breath, my eyes wide and unblinking in the darkness. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes, I slowly, cautiously, lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin. Sleep, of course, was out of the question. My mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation for what I had just heard. Was it the old wiring, shifting foundations, but the distinctness of the sounds, the way they seemed to respond to my attention, felt intelligent. This wasn't an isolated incident. The whispers and the scratching became more frequent, more audacious, weaving themselves into the fabric of my nights with an unsettling regularity. Sometimes it was a soft sigh from the hallway, sometimes a distant hum, almost like a faint, forgotten melody, emanating from the closed-off den that I rarely used. I started to change my habits, staying up later, trying to outwait the phenomena, or going to bed earlier, hoping to be deeply asleep before they began their nightly performance. Neither strategy worked. They simply adapted, their presence a persistent undercurrent to my nocturnal hours. I began to feel a strange, almost voyeuristic relationship forming with these unseen entities. Were they trying to communicate? Were they simply lingering echoes of the past, unable or unwilling to move on? The old house, once a source of comfort and charm, was slowly transforming into something else, a labyrinth of shadows and unexplained sounds, each midnight whisper a thread in a growing tapestry of unease. I found myself becoming hyper-aware of every single noise, every subtle shift in the house's acoustics. The natural sounds of an old home, the groan of the heating system kicking in, the settling of beams, the occasional drip from a leaky faucet, which I once easily identified and dismissed, now became suspect, each one scrutinized for any hint of something more, something other. My imagination, once a pleasant companion, began to work against me, conjuring images in the dark, fabricating meanings for the indiscernible whispers. I would lie awake, listening, sometimes with a strange, morbid curiosity, other times with a genuine prickle of fear trailing down my spine. I started keeping a small notebook beside my bed, meticulously jotting down the time and nature of each occurrence. A faint scraping at 1:17 a.m., a low guttural sigh at 2:05 a.m., seemingly from the living room, the almost melodic hum always from the den at random intervals. The page began to fill with these cryptic entries, a silent testament to the unseen forces that shared my living space. One particular night stands out with stark clarity, etched into my memory with an almost painful precision. The air was heavy, still, and strangely oppressive, even for a late autumn evening. I had been attempting to read in bed, but my eyes kept drifting to the shadows that danced on the ceiling, cast by the streetlights filtering through the ancient oak outside my window. The house felt particularly alive that night, not in a comforting way, but in a way that suggested observation, a quiet, watchful presence. Around 1:30 a.m., a distinct tapping began, slow and deliberate, coming from the empty guest bedroom directly across the hall from mine. Tap, tap, tap. It was too regular, too intentional to be a loose window pane or a branch hitting the exterior. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drum in the echoing silence. I pulled myself upright, my blanket pooling around my waist, my gaze fixed on the closed door of the guest room. The tapping continued, unwavering. After a moment of paralyzed fear, a strange surge of defiance mixed with an almost desperate curiosity spurred me on. I slowly, cautiously swung my legs out of bed. The floorboards groaned faintly under my weight, a familiar sound that for once felt comforting in its normalcy. I crept towards my bedroom door, my hand outstretched, trembling slightly as I reached for the cold doorknob. My fingers brushed against the metal, and just as I was about to turn it, the tapping stopped. Abruptly. The silence that followed was deafening, a sudden vacuum where sound had just been. I stood there for a long moment, frozen, my ear pressed against the cool wood of the door, straining to hear anything. Nothing, not even the usual house sounds. It was as if the entire house had collectively held its breath, waiting, watching. A shiver ran down my spine, despite the warmth of my pajamas. Taking a deep breath, I slowly, carefully opened my door just a crack. The hallway was bathed in faint moonlight, filtering in from the front window, creating long, distorted shadows that stretched and twisted in the gloom. The guest room door was still closed, a dark, unassuming rectangle in the pale light. I opened my door a little wider, peeking out. The hallway was empty, utterly, completely empty. Yet the distinct memory of that tapping, that deliberate, insistent rhythm, lingered in my ears, an echo of an unseen presence. I slowly closed my door, my heart still racing, and leaned against it, my eyes squeezed shut. It was becoming harder and harder to dismiss these things. The rational explanations were wearing thin, fraying at the edges like an old, overused tapestry. And the constant feeling of being watched, of not being truly alone, was starting to wear on my nerves. I found myself checking locks more frequently, glancing over my shoulder in empty rooms, and hesitating before entering a darkened hallway. The once charming quirks of the old house were now sources of anxiety, each creak and groan a potential harbinger of another unexplained sound. I even tried to capture them, these elusive whispers. I bought a small, sensitive audio recorder, placing it strategically in different rooms before I went to bed. I would leave it running throughout the night, hopping to catch something, anything that could provide some tangible proof, some validation of what I was experiencing. Each morning I would retrieve the device, a mix of hope and trepidation swirling within me, and eagerly play back the recordings. Most often it was just silence, punctuated by the faint hum of the recorder itself, or the distant rumble of a truck on the highway, or the chirping of crickets outside. But there were times, just a few times, when something else surfaced. A low, indistinct murmur, barely audible, buried deep within the white noise. It was never clear enough to distinguish words, never distinct enough to offer undeniable proof. It sounded like static, or a radio tuning in and out of a distant station, but with a strange, underlying vocal quality that sent a prickle of unease through me. Was it a trick of the audio, a distortion, or was it indeed the faint, elusive midnight whispers, captured in their spectral essence? I couldn't be sure, and the ambiguity only served to deepen the mystery, to feed the gnawing curiosity that had taken root in my mind. The logical part of me desperately sought answers in the mundane. I called an exterminator, thinking perhaps a family of rats or squirrels had taken up residence in the walls or attic. The exterminator, a kind, elderly man with a weary smile, thoroughly inspected every nook and cranny. He found no evidence of rodents, no signs of animal intrusion. "Old houses just make noise, ma'am," he'd said, his voice gentle as if sensing my unspoken anxieties. "They breathe. They settle. Sometimes they even sigh." He meant it kindly, I know, but his words did little to quell the growing unease within me. I hired an electrician to check the wiring, fearing faulty circuits might be causing strange electrical hums or sparks. He found nothing amiss. All circuits were sound, all wiring up to code. I even had a plumber inspect the pipes, thinking perhaps water pressure fluctuations or hidden leaks could be causing the strange gurgles and creaks. Again, everything checked out. The house, structurally and mechanically, was sound. Yet, the whispers persisted. They seemed to mock my attempts at rationalization, to dance just beyond the reach of scientific explanation. The strangest occurrences, however, were not just auditory. There were subtle shifts in temperature, sudden cold spots that would manifest in the middle of a warm room, lingering for a moment before dissipating as quickly as they appeared. Sometimes, I would catch a fleeting glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision, a shadow detaching itself from the deeper darkness, only to vanish when I turned my head directly towards it. It was like living in a constant state of almost seeing, almost hearing, a perpetual game of hide-and-seek with something unseen. I began to feel a profound sense of isolation, despite being in my own home. The house, which once felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a stage, and I, the reluctant performer, was constantly being watched by an unseen audience. Sleep became a battle, a desperate attempt to sink into unconsciousness before the nightly symphony of whispers and creaks began, or to simply endure it if it already had. I often woke up feeling more tired than when I went to bed, my mind exhausted from the constant vigilance, the silent questioning. I started spending more time outside, seeking solace in the bustling world, in the predictable sounds of traffic and human voices. But even during the day, the memory of the previous night's whispers would cling to me, a subtle hum beneath the surface of my consciousness. I'd find myself looking at my house from across the street, its charming Victorian facade now holding a hint of something more sinister, a veil of mystery that had not been there before. The beautiful old oak tree in the front yard, its branches reaching like gnarled fingers towards the upper windows, now seemed to whisper secrets in the breeze, secrets that only the house truly understood. I wondered about the previous occupants, about their lives within these walls. Had they heard the whispers too? Had they dismissed them? Or had they, like me, slowly succumbed to the unsettling reality of an active, unseen presence? The house had stood for well over a century, accumulating countless stories, countless lives, within its wooden beams and plaster walls. It wasn't hard to imagine that some of those stories, some of those echoes might linger, unable or unwilling to fully depart. I began to research the house's history, digging through old property records at the local library, poring over dusty newspaper archives. I discovered a fascinating lineage of families who had lived there, each leaving their own unique imprint. There were tales of joy and sorrow, births and deaths, all woven into the long tapestry of the house's existence. Nothing overtly tragic or violent stood out. No sensational crimes or public hauntings. Just ordinary lives lived within these very rooms. And yet the whispers persisted. Sometimes, late at night, I would sit in the dimly lit living room simply listening, not trying to rationalize, not trying to explain, just listening. And in those moments, the whispers seemed to shift, to take on a more pronounced characteristic. It wasn't always a voice. Sometimes it was a sound that seemed to emanate from an object. The faint, almost imperceptible rustle of pages from an old, leather-bound book on the shelf. The soft clinking of silverware in the closed dining room cabinet. The distinct, gentle rocking of the antique rocking chair in the corner of the living room, even when no breeze was present to stir it. These were not loud, dramatic events, but rather subtle, almost shy expressions of an unseen presence, as if it were testing my perception, gauging my reaction. And my reaction, invariably, was a slow, creeping chill, a sense of profound otherness that settled deep within my bones. I remember one particular instance when the whispers felt almost personal. I was in the kitchen making a cup of tea when I distinctly heard my name called, softly. A woman's voice, a gentle, almost melodic tone. It sounded as if she were standing just behind me, directly over my shoulder. I spun around, my heart leaping into my throat, spilling a bit of hot water onto the counter. There was no one there. The kitchen was empty, bathed in the pale glow of the night light I kept on. The suddenness, the clarity, and the intimacy of hearing my own name spoken aloud by an unseen entity was far more unsettling than any ambiguous creak or scratch. It made the presence feel less like a lingering echo and more like a conscious entity, aware of me, perhaps even trying to communicate. My hands trembled as I finished making my tea, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder repeatedly, a constant state of vigilance settling over me. That night, I barely slept. Every shadow seemed to hold a form, every subtle draft a touch, every tiny house sound a potential whisper on the wind. The house, once a comforting haven, was becoming a place of increasing psychological tension. I started to question my own sanity, wondering if the isolation, the quiet, the sheer age of the house was finally getting to me. Was I imagining these things? Was my mind, deprived of consistent, restful sleep, creating these auditory hallucinations? The thought was almost as terrifying as the idea of an actual haunting. To lose faith in my own senses, to doubt my own perception of reality, felt like a slow, insidious unraveling. I tried to talk to friends about it, cautiously at first, testing the waters. I'd casually mention weird noises in my old house, or the way old houses creak. Most would nod empathetically, sharing their own anecdotes about quirky plumbing or drafts. But when I tried to delve deeper, to hint at the more inexplicable, the whispers, the distinct sounds, I could see the subtle shift in their expressions, the polite but wary glances. They didn't want to entertain the idea of the truly supernatural, and I couldn't blame them. It was unsettling enough for me, living it. So I largely kept it to myself, these midnight whispers and the increasing conviction that I was not alone. The house, in its silent, ancient wisdom, seemed to know. It held its secrets close, revealing them only to me in the dead of night when the rest of the world was asleep. And as I lay in bed, listening, truly listening, I began to perceive subtle nuances in the whispers, a sort of silent language beneath the audible sounds. Sometimes they felt curious, almost playful, like a child exploring a new space. Other times they felt heavy with a profound sadness, a lingering melancholy that seemed to permeate the very air. And sometimes, though rarely, there was a flash of something sharp, something cold, a flicker of an emotion that suggested anger or resentment. These were the moments that truly chilled me, making the hairs on my arms stand on end, a primal fear bubbling up from deep within. The idea that whatever shared my home might not be benign, that its intentions might be unclear or even malevolent, was a thought I tried desperately to push away, but it always lingered, a dark shadow at the edge of my consciousness. I began to spend more evenings in the library, not just researching the house, but immersing myself in books about folklore, paranormal phenomena, and even psychology, trying to find any explanation, any pattern, anything that could shed light on my experiences. I learned about residual hauntings, where events from the past are imprinted on a location, playing out like a loop. I read about intelligent hauntings, where an entity is aware and capable of interaction. And I delved into the psychological aspects of perception, the way our brains can trick us, especially in states of fatigue or stress. Each avenue of research offered tantalizing possibilities but no definitive answers. The whispers remained just that, whispers, elusive and enigmatic. One night the rhythmic scratching returned, but this time it was from the attic directly above my bedroom. It wasn't the tentative, delicate scratching I had heard before. This was louder, more insistent, almost frantic, as if something was desperately trying to get out or perhaps desperately trying to get in. My eyes shot open and I lay there, absolutely rigid, listening to the unsettling sound directly overhead. It lasted for what felt like an eternity, a relentless scraping and thumping that echoed through the otherwise silent house. My heart hammered, a painful throb in my chest. I considered calling for help, but what would I even say? There's something scratching in my attic. It sounded absurd even to me. Eventually, after what felt like an hour but was probably only 10 minutes, the sounds ceased as abruptly as they had begun. A profound silence descended once more, heavy and suffocating. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just lay there, staring at the ceiling, imagining what unseen force had been making such a commotion above me, a palpable sense of dread settling over the entire house. The very architecture of the old house, with its high ceilings and hidden spaces, seemed to amplify the mystery, making every shadow deeper, every creak more pronounced. The thought of something unseen in the attic, a space I rarely ventured into, filled me with a unique dread. What if whatever was up there decided to descend? The following morning, after a restless night of fitful, anxiety-ridden sleep, I finally decided I had to confront the source of the scratching. Armed with a flashlight, a sturdy broomstick, and a reluctant resolve, I ascended the rickety pull-down stairs to the attic. The air in the attic was stale and heavy, thick with the scent of aged wood and forgotten things. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of sunlight that pierced the grimy windows. Boxes piled high, draped with old sheets, created a landscape of forgotten memories. I scanned the space, shining my flashlight into every dark corner, my heart thumping a nervous rhythm in my chest. There was nothing. No signs of forced entry, no disturbed insulation, no indication of a physical presence. The dust on the floor was undisturbed, a thick, even layer covering everything. It was as if the frantic scratching had simply been sound without a source, without a physical manifestation. The absence of any tangible evidence was almost more unsettling than finding a small creature, or even something more sinister. It reinforced the idea that whatever was creating these disturbances was not of the physical world, not bound by the rules of tangible existence. My mind grappled with this, the rational part of me struggling to accept the irrational, the unexplainable. The whispers after that incident seemed to gain a new intensity. They became less fleeting, less ambiguous. Sometimes they were accompanied by a faint, cold breath that would brush against my skin, sending shivers down my arms. Other times I would smell things, the faint, sweet scent of old roses, or the lingering aroma of pipe tobacco, neither of which had any discernible source in my home. These sensory experiences added another layer to the enigma, making the presence feel more multifaceted, more complex than just simple sounds. It was as if whatever was there was slowly, carefully, revealing more of itself, testing my boundaries, gauging how much I could endure before breaking. I found myself walking through the house during the day, trying to mentally prepare myself for the night, for the inevitable descent into that strange, liminal space where the known and unknown blurred. I'd stand in the middle of a room, trying to feel the energy, trying to connect with whatever was there, to understand its purpose, its message. But all I ever felt was a profound sense of quiet observation, an unblinking gaze from the shadows. One particularly quiet Tuesday night, I was sitting in the living room, simply existing in the stillness. It was past 2 a.m. and the city outside had long since fallen asleep. The only light came from a single lamp in the corner, casting warm, golden pools on the oriental rug. I had chosen not to read, not to distract myself, but to simply be present, to listen. And then it happened. Not a whisper, not a scratch, but a distinct, heavy thud. It came from upstairs, from directly above me in what used to be the master bedroom. It wasn't the settling of the house, nor the shifting of furniture. This was a definite, impactful thud, as if something heavy had been deliberately dropped. My entire body tensed, my breath caught in my throat. I waited, straining my ears, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. Silence. Absolute silence. The kind of silence that feels pregnant with anticipation, brimming with unseen tension. After a few long moments, I slowly rose from my chair, my movements deliberate, cautious. I crept towards the staircase, each step a conscious effort. The old wooden stairs creaked beneath my weight, a familiar protest that now felt ominous. As I ascended, the air grew noticeably colder, a sharp, biting chill that penetrated my thick sweater. The landing at the top of the stairs was bathed in deeper shadow, the moonlight unable to fully penetrate its gloom. The door to the master bedroom was slightly ajar, a sliver of darkness visible within. I pushed it open slowly, my hand trembling slightly on the cool metal knob. The room was empty, utterly, completely empty. The bed, the dresser, the nightstands, all were exactly as I had left them that morning. Nothing was out of place. Nothing had fallen. The floor was clear. Yet the distinct memory of that heavy thud, that undeniable sound, lingered in my ears, an echo in the palpable stillness of the room. I stood there for a long time, scanning every corner, every shadow, trying to reconcile what I had heard with what I was seeing. The discrepancy was profoundly unsettling. It meant that whatever was causing these sounds was not interacting with the physical world in a way I could comprehend. It was creating effects without causes, sounds without sources, a phenomenon that all logic and reason. This was no longer just an old house making noise. This was something else entirely. And as I slowly retreated from the cold, silent bedroom, a profound sense of resignation began to settle over me. I knew, with an unshakable certainty, that I would never fully understand the midnight whispers of my old house. They were a part of its very essence, woven into its ancient timbers and crumbling plaster. And I, for better or worse, was now a part of their story, a temporary resident in a home that held secrets far older and deeper than I could ever truly fathom. The house continued its nightly symphony of the unexplainable, each whisper, each creak, each inexplicable sound, a gentle reminder that I was never truly alone, even in the deepest silence of the night. It was a strange companionship, this unseen presence, one that sometimes brought a prickle of fear, but also in its own peculiar way a sense of wonder. The old house, with its midnight whispers, had become more than just a place to live. It had become a mystery, a silent, enduring testament to the unseen forces that sometimes linger just beyond the veil of our understanding, patiently waiting for us to listen in the quiet hours of the night. And as the nights continued to pass, bringing with them their familiar symphony of subtle sounds and unexplained occurrences, I found myself developing a curious sort of truce with the unseen inhabitants of my old house. The fear, though never entirely gone, had begun to mellow into a respectful, albeit constant, awareness. I no longer jumped at every creak or whispered suggestion of a voice. Instead, I listened, sometimes with a quiet resignation, other times with a strange, almost meditative attentiveness. It was as if the house and I had reached an unspoken understanding, a silent agreement to coexist within this liminal space between the tangible and the ethereal. The midnight whispers, once a source of deep anxiety, now felt like a familiar lullaby, albeit a deeply unsettling one, accompanying me through the long, quiet hours of darkness. The house truly did breathe, just as the exterminator had said, but its breath was not merely the settling of old wood and plaster. It was the soft, lingering exhalations of its past, the faint echoes of lives long lived, with something more ephemeral, something that whispered secrets only the night could truly understand. And as the moonlight streamed through my bedroom window, painting the familiar room in shades of silver and shadow, I would close my eyes and listen, truly listen, to the midnight whispers of my old house, knowing that they were a part of its story and now, inextricably, a part of mine.